Imagine waking up every day in a world where every choice seems pre-planned, every word carefully measured, and every step monitored. In this place, people move like the cogs of a well-oiled machine, uncertain where their own will begins, and the invisible control of the system ends. Here, eye-catching discounts lead the crowd toward reckless consumption, while every glance and every gesture is captured by invisible cameras. In this world, expressing a unique idea feels like a risk, a dangerous whisper. This description might sound like a fictional story, but in reality, it's closer to our daily lives than we might think. George Orwell, in his book 1984, introduced us to a similar scenario, where mass control infiltrates every aspect of life, and where freedom is, in truth, an illusion. Throughout this guide, we'll explore how some of these control mechanisms portrayed in Orwell's work are already part of our everyday lives. Ready to see what may have previously gone unnoticed? In an increasingly connected and capitalist world, consumption has shifted from being merely a necessity to becoming an act of identity and, in many cases, a form of control. Flash sales, overwhelming discounts, and the pressure to always buy the newest and best are not just sales tactics. They're powerful mechanisms that shape mass behavior. Imagine this. A store announces a 50% discount on a specific product for just a few hours. This type of offer creates a sense of urgency, forcing impulsive decisions where the fear of missing out outweighs the actual need for the item. How many times have we fallen for this impulse? Buying something that might not even be useful, but in that moment seemed impossible to resist. This collective behavior phenomenon, which at first seems harmless, is actually a powerful manipulation tool. Major sales events like Black Friday turn everyday consumers into a synchronized mass, acting with an almost automatic intensity, where individual choice dissolves into a collective will. In a way, this dynamic reflects what George Orwell presents in 1984, where economic manipulation is one of the primary foundations for psychological and social control. After all, while we believe we're choosing what to buy, we're actually guided by invisible patterns that shape our desires and reinforce the market's power over our decisions. Our shopping behavior, stimulated and predicted by these marketing strategies, becomes part of the control system. In a world where emotions are continuously manipulated by advertisements, eye-catching banners and persuasive slogans, the desire to consume doesn't come from within. Rather, it emerges from an environment crafted to stir that need. And so, instead of being agents of our choices, we become pieces on a board, shaped by interests we don't always see. Collectivism is a concept that inspires the idea of unity, of a greater purpose shared by people who believe in common goals. But when collectivism is distorted, it can turn into something quite different, a space where unity gives way to oppression. In theory, working for the group's good sounds noble, but what happens when this greater good becomes an excuse to suppress individuality and differences? In totalitarian regimes, the value of the collective stands out so strongly that there's no room left for dissenting opinions. Those who don't fall in line, who dare to question, are seen as threats and are often eliminated from the system. George Orwell, in 1984, warns us precisely about this thin line, where what seems like unity is actually a prison. Herd behavior is one of the consequences of this collective oppression. When people don't feel free to express their own voice, they end up adopting the opinions imposed by the group. This happens not only in political regimes but also in everyday situations, where the need to belong and feel accepted leads many to give up their own ideas and desires. Think of social media, for example, where a simple comment opposing the majority's view can trigger a flood of criticism and canceling. This environment, where everyone thinks the same, is not truly a reflection of unity. It's a reflection of fear of standing out, of being judged, of losing one's place within a collective that seems safe, but, in reality, limits who each person can be. The danger of this type of collectivism is precisely the space it opens for authoritarianism, when the group becomes more significant than the individual. Differing ideas and critical voices are quickly silenced, and the authority of those who control the group becomes unchallengeable. Orwell reminds us that, in such environments, freedom is the first thing to disappear, and with it, people's authenticity. Being part of something larger is indeed valuable. But when it comes at the cost of individual freedom, What remains is a society where everyone appears the same but is imprisoned by their own fear. The creation of crises is one of the most effective tools for maintaining control over a society. When a population is constantly exposed to problems, real or manufactured, a state of collective anxiety arises that's hard to break. In 1984, Orwell portrays the role of propaganda in fabricating crises and imaginary enemies, creating a climate of fear that paralyzes society and makes it dependent on a centralizing state. This environment of constant tension doesn't allow people to think critically. Instead, everyone is focused on survival, waiting eagerly for the next solution offered by those in power. This tactic is not limited to the world of fiction. In our daily lives, we're constantly bombarded with alarming information and threats from all directions. The media often amplifies problems and crises, generating a sense of insecurity that makes us more inclined to accept quick and simplistic solutions, even if it means giving up certain freedoms. When fear sets in, reason takes a back seat, and that's when control becomes easier. After all, who will question the need for a surveillance system when that system promises to protect them from a constant threat? This manipulation through crises traps us in a cycle of dependency. Rather than questioning the origin and validity of certain situations, we're led to blindly trust the answers given to us. The result is an anxious and misinformed society, dependent on authority figures for any sense of security. Orwell shows us that this dependency is no accident. It's part of a carefully designed system to keep the masses under control. And as long as this dependency exists, true freedom remains out of reach. In 1984, Orwell presents a world where superpowers are locked in constant war, a battle that never ends, but also never reaches its peak. This unending conflict is not a miscalculation or a diplomatic failure. It's a perfectly designed system to keep the population under control. The idea is simple, but devastating. As long as society believes it is constantly threatened by an external enemy, it more readily accepts internal control. After all, in times of war, it's natural for freedoms to be temporarily restricted in the name of safety. But in the case of a war that never ends, these restrictions also become permanent. This dynamic isn't limited to Orwell's fictional world. How often have we heard about conflicts that seem unsolvable, where true peace sounds almost impossible? Reality shows us that many of these conflicts, be they political, economic, or cultural, seem to serve interests beyond simply resolving the issue. When a country is at war, the population is more likely to surrender freedoms and rights, believing it's necessary for collective security. Meanwhile, people's attention is focused on the enemy out there. While internal issues go unnoticed or are accepted without question, this structure of control keeps society in a constant state of lack and dependence. Resources are diverted to sustain the war effort, while the population lives with less freedom, less access to services, and less autonomy. Orwell shows that when war is endless, the cycle of control is endless too. Distracted by the external enemy, the population becomes easier to manipulate and less inclined to question the oppressive system. Thus, the eternal conflict ensures peace, but the peace of a submissive people. In 1984, Orwell presents a society rigidly divided into three castes: the inner party, the outer party, and the proles. Each of these social strata has a clearly defined role in the totalitarian state of Oceania's control structure, and this division is essential to the absolute rule of Big Brother. At the top of the pyramid is the inner party, a small group of people who hold true power and are loyal to Big Brother. This group makes the decisions and enjoys privileges the others can't even imagine. Right below them is the outer party, a class of administrators and bureaucrats who are manipulated by the inner party and follow orders without question. And at the base are the proles, the largest class but also the most ignored and exploited. They are kept in extreme poverty and ignorance, deemed by the state as incapable of revolt. This hierarchical structure prevents any possibility of social mobility or power shifts. Each group is kept in its place, with its functions and limitations well established. The outer party, which could pose a threat to the inner party's power, is kept under constant surveillance and lives a life of fear and restrictions, where even thought is controlled. Meanwhile, the proles, considered subhuman, receive only enough to survive and are ignored by the state, a strategy that keeps them in a state of alienation and apathy. Posing no threat to the established order, Orwell shows us that this rigid division serves a clear purpose, ensuring that power is never questioned or redistributed. By structuring society in this way, Big Brother creates an almost unbreakable machine of control, where each individual lives according to their assigned role, never glimpsing the possibility of change. And so, the hierarchy becomes a prison, invisible but inescapable, where each person is controlled not only by the state, but by the very role imposed upon them. Constant surveillance is one of the most frightening aspects of the world in 1984, in Oceania. No one is safe from Big Brother's gaze. Cameras, microphones, and spies make it impossible for anyone to have a moment of true privacy. This creates an environment where each person feels always watched, even when, in practice, they might not be. This state of continuous alert profoundly impacts people's minds, who, fearing any suspicious action, begin to repress their own thoughts and emotions. After all, a misplaced expression or a look of doubt can be enough to condemn someone. This kind of surveillance doesn't just affect outward behavior, it reaches the deepest levels of individuality. Before long, people start to internalize Big Brother's gaze, living as if he is always present in their thoughts. It's as if there's a second consciousness, constantly monitoring what can or cannot be expressed. This psychological repression ultimately destroys trust among citizens, as everyone becomes a potential informer. No one knows who they can trust, and thus, fear and distrust become the norm. In real life, the psychological impact of living under surveillance is also very present. Even though we're not in a totalitarian regime like that in 1984, many of us have experienced the feeling of being monitored, whether by cameras, social media, or data that companies and governments constantly collect. This feeling reminds us that an external gaze is always there, ready to judge. And so, constant surveillance not only controls what we do, but shapes who we are, limiting our freedom and authenticity. In 1984, Newspeak is one of the party's most powerful weapons for controlling the population. The idea is simple but devastating. By reducing people's vocabulary, the party also limits their ability to think and express complex or opposing ideas. After all, how can someone challenge the government if the words to question or even express freedom? Injustice and oppression don't exist. The power of Newspeak goes far beyond mere linguistic modification. It's a tool for mental control, causing people to accept the party's impositions without question, because they lack the linguistic means even to conceive an alternative. Language shapes thought. And Orwell shows us that by restricting communication, the party makes certain concepts literally unthinkable. With Newspeak, vocabulary is simplified to the extreme, and words take on a single, unchanging meaning, instead of bad or terrible. For example, they use ungood to simplify and suppress the expression of emotional and intellectual nuances. When freedom of expression is removed, people not only lose the right to disagree, but also the ability to understand why they would disagree. Newspeak is thus a system that limits the mind, creating a conformist society where critical thinking is eliminated at the root. This concept isn't far from reality. In many situations, we see how language use can be manipulated to influence how people perceive the world, from euphemisms that soften harsh realities to words loaded with bias. The way we communicate directly shapes how we think. Newspeak teaches us that when we lose words, we also lose the freedom to think fully. And without this freedom, control over ideas becomes an inescapable reality. The concept of doublethink is one of the most disturbing ideas in 1984. It's the ability to hold two contradictory beliefs at once and still accept both as true. In Oceania, this practice is essential for the mental survival of citizens, as the party demands total adherence to its directives, even when those directives change constantly. Today, Oceania is at war with Eurasia. Tomorrow, it has always been at peace with Eurasia and at war with Eastasia. For the party, truth is whatever they say in the moment, and doublethink allows the population to accept these changes without hesitation. This manipulation mechanism works as a form of self-preservation, where individuals learn not to question or rationalize the contradictions imposed by the system. It's as if there's a mental disconnection between what one sees and what one believes. The mind adapts to survive in this environment, where critical thinking is a threat to personal safety. Orwell shows us that this internalized contradiction undermines people's very ability to distinguish reality from fiction, as truth becomes a malleable concept, exclusively controlled by the party. Thus, coherence and rationality become irrelevant, and total state control is established over a population that no longer questions, because it lacks the means to do so. In our daily lives, doublethink also manifests in situations where we are led to accept conflicting information without realizing it. How many times have we heard contradictory statements from authoritative sources, yet adapted quickly to them, in a world where information flows chaotically and truths change constantly? Doublethink emerges as an unconscious response. Orwell's lesson is clear. Contradiction as a tool of control destroys the capacity for critical thinking and creates a society where truth is a reflection of power, not reality. In 1984, cultural control is one of the most effective ways to dominate the minds of the population. Books, plays, and any form of art that might provoke questioning are rigorously censored or destroyed. Classics by authors like Shakespeare are banned because their works highlight themes of freedom, love, and humanity, ideas dangerous to a regime that needs a conformist, submissive society. Cultural censorship is not merely about restricting access to certain content. It's about depriving the population of any reference that might remind them of a life beyond the party's grip. Orwell shows us that by eliminating art and critical thinking, the party creates a vacuum where the past becomes irrelevant, and the present is the only reality that matters, without access to other ways of seeing and thinking about the world. Oceania's population has no basis to question what is imposed upon them. Books and critical works are powerful because they connect individuals to a tradition of ideas and values that go beyond the current moment. When these works are removed, people lose the ability to compare the present with other eras or cultures and, with that, also lose the capacity to imagine a different future. This practice of cultural censorship also reflects reality. How often, in times of political or social crisis, do we see works being banned, censored, or altered to serve controlling interests? Cultural censorship, as Orwell warns, is not just an attack on freedom of expression. It's an attack on a society's ability to understand its history and its role in the world. When culture is silenced, the freedom to think and be oneself becomes a distant memory. In 1984, Orwell introduces us to one of the regime's most emblematic events, the 2 minutes hate during this period. The party directs the population's hatred toward a designated enemy, keeping people in a state of fury and hostility. This mobilization of hatred is not merely a propaganda moment, but a strategy of emotional and psychological control that creates a false sense of unity and loyalty among citizens by channeling internal frustrations toward an external target. The party diverts attention from the real issues within Oceania, preventing people from questioning or rebelling against the system itself. Collective hatred is a powerful tool for social control. When people's emotions are manipulated in this way, they become more susceptible to obedience, united by feelings of anger and the desire to defeat a common enemy. This dynamic can also be seen outside of fiction. In real life, it's common for leaders and systems to use external enemies, whether real or fictitious, to reinforce national identity and silence opposition. The more people focus on the designated enemy, the less they worry about questioning who is truly in control. Orwell warns us about the corrosive power of organized hatred. By manipulating collective emotions, the state creates a society where empathy and critical thinking are replaced by blind obedience and hollow patriotism. Hatred becomes an emotional prison, where citizens lose sight of reality and become complicit in their own oppression. Throughout 1984, Orwell leaves us with a powerful reminder of what happens when freedom and individuality are crushed by absolute control. Yet, at the end of this reflection, an inevitable question arises. Are we truly free to think? In a world where information is shaped, crises are amplified, and hatred is manipulated, personal autonomy seems increasingly distant. But if 1984 was a warning, let it inspire us to seek truth more fervently, to question the information we receive, and to reclaim our capacity for independent thought. Freedom is not a concession. It's a continuous act of courage. It begins the moment we have the courage to question, to look beyond appearances, and to value truth over convenience. May we keep Orwell's message alive, so we never stop thinking for ourselves.